Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And like I said, people may be joining, and that's fine. But I'll start just by introducing our esteemed guest tonight. Professor McDaniel is the chair of the history department at Rice University, my alma mater, and the Mary Gibbs Jones Professor of Humanities. He is a historian of slavery, abolitionism, transatlantic reform, and the 19th century United States. His first book, The Problem of Democracy in the Age of Slavery, won the Merle Curdy Award from the Organization of American Historians and the James Broussard Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Professor McDaniel's most recent book, Sweet Taste of Liberty, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019 and won the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for History. It was also the latest read for HYLA's Allyship Book Club. It tells the story of Henrietta Wood, a woman who was born enslaved, freed before the Civil War, kidnapped and re-enslaved, and then freed again by the war. In 1870, she sued the man who had kidnapped and enslaved her in a federal court and won. In addition to his research and teaching, Professor McDaniel serves as the co-chair of Rice's Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Injustice, and co-host of the Task Force's podcast, Dr. Fox. And I mentioned that, Professor McDaniel, because I have some questions about that, and maybe the others who have joined tonight do too. So welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you and this opportunity to ask you some questions about your wonderful book that I have here with me and we've all really enjoyed.
Well, no, thanks to you for reading the book. It's always a pleasure to get to speak with people who have engaged with it. I hope you've been as impacted by the story of Henrietta Wood as I was in researching and writing it, and grateful to be with you to talk about it today.
And I'd like to start there with your decision to write this book, how you discovered the story of Miss Wood, and talk a bit about your process. But before I let you answer, I'm going to encourage people who have joined, if they're comfortable and their circumstances permit, to turn on their video so this can be more like one of our book club meetings and not just a webinar. We intentionally set it up as a meeting. And then also, I have plenty of questions prepared, but I don't want to be the only one asking questions. So if you have a question, if you could please say so in the chat or just interrupt me, raise your hand using the reaction feature. Any of those will work. Okay, Professor McDaniel.
Sure, thanks. So I can talk a little bit about when I started working on the book. I first learned about the story of Henrietta Wood in the fall of 2014 when I was doing research for what I thought would be a very different book. I was interested in researching the experiences of enslaved people who were brought to Texas during the Civil War by Confederate planters who were fleeing from their home states to evade the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, in the book, I talk about this phenomenon of refuging to Texas. And, I was interested in that partly because a lot of historians of the Civil War era in recent years have called our attention to the very jagged process by which slavery ended in the United States, that it wasn't a light bulb moment where because the Emancipation Proclamation was issued or even because the war ended, slavery had ended everywhere and freedom was a fact on the ground. Many people remained enslaved beyond the end of the war, and calling attention to that, I think, has been an important theme in recent scholarship on this period. So I was interested in this one slice of that theme, the story in Texas. And I, as academic historians do, was presenting a piece of that research at an academic conference when a colleague of mine at Vanderbilt University, Richard Blackett, a great historian whose works I'd recommend to you on the history of the fugitive slave law in particular and African-American abolitionists in the 19th century. He, in the process of doing his research on the Underground Railroad in the Ohio River Valley, came across the interview with Henrietta Wood in the Ripley Bee, the Ripley, Ohio Bee. And he sent it to me one day in 2014 and said, "You really should take a look at this story because it involved her trip to Texas, the forced march to Texas." And so at first I was interested in it as part of this other project, but the more I began learning about it and reading the interview, the more it became clear that this was a story that needed to to be told at length, and for the things that it could tell us about a variety of things, not just about refugeeing in Texas, but also about the long struggle for reparations, about convict leasing because of Zebulon Ward's own history leading up to the trial, about her experience not only in Texas, but in the Ohio River Valley in Louisiana. And so, the more I learned, the more I became convinced that that this was the book that I wanted to focus my attention on. But it wasn't immediately clear that in the fall of 2014 that would be possible. At that time I had just the Ripley B interview, which actually appeared over 4 issues of that newspaper in several installments. And the first installment is from an issue that's no longer extant, just has never been found. We have this almost complete run of the Ripley B, but that issue is missing, which is a testament, as I talk about in the appendix to the book, to the gaps in the archive and the difficulty that historians can sometimes have reconstructing stories like this. And so I didn't know anything from the Ripley B about her early life. The interview there in 1879 begins with her kidnapping and the trip in the curtained carriage across the Ohio River. And so there were some references in the interview to her earlier life, but nothing like a detailed account. And so it wasn't until about a year later that a few other discoveries in the research process helped to connect some dots. One was the other interview that, of course, is at the center of the book with Lafcadio Hearn from 1876. And in that interview begins from the beginning of her life up to the trial. And secondly, around that same time, I learned about her son, Arthur H. Sims, and his life in Chicago and the interview that he gave in 1948 in the Chicago Tribune. And then it was around that very same time that I was able to go to Chicago and locate the original case file that had so many other documents confirming the verdict and showing that she had received payment from Zebulon Ward, and leaving all kinds of clues that connected me to other sources as well. So that's in brief the story of how I got started on the book.
And I'm just not as familiar with this process for historians. How did you make those discoveries? So you have the one source. What is your process like to try and uncover these other sources and other archives?
Well, I think it varies from project to project and source to source and the kind of work that you're doing. In this case, the determination of Henrietta Wood to tell her story, both in the early moments of her ordeal in the kidnapping, but also over the course of many years, and the memory that she had of details in the case, names of people that she encountered, places where she had been enslaved, dates, all of that provided a kind of list of things that could be run down in public records to begin with. So you could start looking in census records, you could start looking in county courthouses to find references to the people that are mentioned there. Now I think in a lot of ways this kind of research has been eased, but not it's been made easier, I'll say, by the digitization of so many 19th century resources, newspapers. You can go on a database, and I think I was helped to some extent by the fact that some of the names in the story, like Zebulon Ward, are pretty unique names. If Zebulon Ward's name had been John Smith, it might have been a little bit harder to find as much so rapidly about him, which connected to other stories relevant to her. So there's kind of a recursive process of moving back and forth from the kinds of things you can find in a digitized database and the kinds of things that you can only find by going to a place like the National Archives and seeing the handwritten case files. Those kinds of things can't be turned up by a keyword search because they haven't been transcribed. Or a lot of the lawsuits involving, the Sarode family, for example, which were critical for understanding her experience in Louisiana and how she got back to Kentucky, and what was the sort of false premises on which Zebulon Ward claimed her as a property in Kentucky. All of that required going to archives and looking at these original case files and the handwritten affidavits and petitions in those cases.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Unique names help us in our practice too, or at least they help me when I'm trying to track people down, et cetera. So I understand that point. In the process of conducting research and writing the book, what were your goals? What did you hope for the book as you were telling the story of Henrietta Wood?
Great question. Well, if you think back to when this research started in 2014, that was a moment really very much like the moment we currently find ourselves in, the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement. There was a conversation about reparations. There were ongoing protests about police brutality and the long legacies of slavery in American life. That summer, Ta-Nehisi Coates published an award-winning article called "The Case for Reparations" in the Atlantic magazine. And, that didn't start a conversation around reparations, but it certainly revived a conversation that had been going on for many decades and really gaining steam in the 21st century because of lawsuits that have been filed against universities and financial institutions and various companies in the early 2000s. Many universities undertaking the histories of their own institutions' entanglement with the history of slavery. So all of that was kind of a backdrop to first learning about the case. And I think when I first read in the Ripley Bee about the outcome of the case, which was, as I argue in the book, a really remarkable and unprecedented, never matched amount for a formerly enslaved person to win from a federal court. It seemed to me that with all of the debates happening about reparations, cases for reparations, cases being made against reparations, that potentially this was a case of reparations, or a story that could inform those debates by looking at the history of one woman and her efforts to hold Zebulon Ward to account. So that, I think, was my initial intention, and I think my thinking about it, though, shifted and evolved over the course of writing the book. I think initially, when I was writing proposals, for example, to get help to go to archives and look at these sources, I was often describing it as a case of reparations. And then, as you know from the subtitle in the book, the subtitle is A True Story of Slavery and Restitution in America. And from reading the epilogue, I hope I'm not spoiling anything, or you've already discussed the book, or you've already gotten to the end of the book. So, I think the question that I kept grappling with was the one of how to regard this victory. This was a remarkable sum that clearly made a difference in her life and the life of her descendants. But it was also only a fraction of what she had asked the court for. And of course, it didn't change, that Zebulon Ward had amassed a massive fortune through slavery and its afterlives after the Civil War. And so I started to think about the case a little bit differently. And I hoped that following this story would leave readers less with a kind of final answer and more with a sense of the ambivalence of the outcome.
Your final question did stand out to us. I think it actually came up in our second meeting on the book, and we had 3. And I'm just curious, this wasn't the next question I was going to ask, but since you brought it up, was that a big decision to decide to end the book with the question, did she win? How did you decide that was going to be what you wanted to leave readers with?
Well, it was a question that kept coming up whenever I would start telling the story. I mean, I gave one example in the epilogue, but you know, whenever I would start talking to people about what I was working on, that a woman who was born enslaved, she had been free before the Civil War in Cincinnati, kidnapped, re-enslaved, taken to Mississippi, taken to Texas, returning to Cincinnati. That was the question everyone immediately wanted to know. Did she win? What was the outcome of the case? So it gave me a lot of time to think about it. Just that's how often I was hearing the question. And some earlier drafts of the book, I kind of started the book with that question. So began with going to the archive and leaving that question hanging over the narrative. But it seemed to me in the course of revision that that it would be better suited as a final word in the epilogue, partly because I didn't really want, you know, in the course of revision, at first I started by going to the archive, but it seemed important to get to the story at the heart of the book more quickly and not to start with my own research. So that moved that to the end. And I think there were some other books that I read that pack a similar punch in the last line. One by Kevin Boyle called Arc of Justice, which is about, I think it'd be interesting to your group as well, about a trial involving an African-American man who was put on trial for murder. His house was surrounded by an angry white mob when he attempted to integrate an all-white neighborhood in Detroit in the early 20th century, and he was defended by the great lawyer Clarence Darrow for you know, to say that he was acting in self-defense. And so it's kind of set in the Great Migration and the Jazz Age, and also this kind of the story of racial discrimination in housing. And I won't tell you how it ends, but it also has, I think, a last line that really sticks with you. So that was a model as well. But it seemed, you know, I think my editor, academics aren't really, we don't like to leave questions open in books. Often, you know, we like to lead with the argument, and probably, I don't know, what would be good practice for a lawyer as well. Maybe you want your closing argument to be really clear and definite. But my editor, who was helping me think about how to write a book that would appeal not just to academic readers, but to anyone who would be picking up the book, you know, he made the strong case that you know, readers like to come to conclusions, and those conclusions are sort of more deeply held if they feel that they've come to them themselves. So all of that was part of the thinking. But I have to say that really the most important reason is because, as you know from looking at the interviews, is I don't really know how Henrietta Wood herself would have answered that question. The second interview in 1879 was conducted after the verdict, but before she had received the checks, as she said, from Zebulon Ward. And after that interview, even though we know about her moving to Chicago, she appears in the census, her own voice, even in this mediated way, doesn't appear again in the documentary record. And so because I don't really know for certain how she would have regarded this outcome, I thought it important to leave that question open at the end of the book.
Well, that and so much of the rest of the book was a great launching point for our discussions. And I appreciate the other book recommendation. I was going to ask you if you had any recommendations. We actually read Between the World and Me before your book, and then we read So You Want to Talk About Race before that, and we're picking our next book now. And talking about the justice system, obviously we're a group of lawyers, so there were several parts of the book that really spoke to us. Part was her legal process. We also really enjoyed something I'd like to ask you about, all the citations in your open source process. You know, as lawyers, we have footnotes for everything. But going back to the legal process, and I think it's an especially timely question today with the jury verdict in the George Floyd murder trial, is to ask, in your research, in what ways did you think the legal justice system both helped Miss Wood, and in what ways did it hold her back? What were the obstacles, and what were the values that it provided to her based on your very close intimacy with this story?
It's a great question, and certainly I think you're right. I've been thinking about it today, in light of the news about the verdict, that her case also was a victory in a sense, a verdict in a sense, and yet it left unfinished a larger struggle for reckoning with slavery and racial injustice. It didn't, and I think her experience with the justice system, it has both sides of the story, because she attempted to file this freedom suit in Kentucky, or there was a freedom suit filed in Kentucky after her kidnapping. And there she found, she did not find success, in the case, and very fatefully, because her freedom, in a sense, depended on a piece of paper and the documentation that she no longer had in that place and at that time, to show that she had been free in Cincinnati. And then, of course, later, there is this moment of opportunity during Reconstruction where a federal court is willing to hear her story. And even there, though, you're right to point out there were many obstacles, and the litigation, dragged on for 8 years. And then even when a verdict was handed down, there was an effort to file a motion for a new trial. And so it wasn't yet for another year that a final verdict was reached. So I'm struck by how much had to go right in order for her to win even this modest sum. First of all, she had to survive this long ordeal, which is no small thing. Return to the scene of the crime, as it were, in Cincinnati, locate this particular man, Zebulon Ward, who had kidnapped and enslaved her, and persist over 8 years, when there were many moments where the litigation stalled, or her lawyers weren't really pushing it forward. So there's a lot that had to kind of align in order for that to happen. And had this dragged out a few more years, the drift in jurisprudence was definitely in the direction of more restricted interpretations of the Reconstruction amendments, and so we can wonder whether, if it had happened any earlier or any later, whether the outcome would have been quite the same. And I think too, the standing that she had to file this suit was made possible partly by the fact that she had been free and kidnapped and enslaved, and that, of course, was not the case for the vast majority of formerly enslaved people in the United States after the Civil War. And so I think it spotlights some of the limits of the pursuit of justice through litigation like this, which is not in any way to diminish the significance of what she achieved. Again, it shows what even a small amount of money could mean for her and her family, and certainly the reaction from the newspaper press at the time shows how exceptional it was. People reacted in a way that showed this was not common, and it was unprecedented. But then it didn't really set a precedent for more such cases, or create the kind of larger reckoning that I think advocates of reparations even today are hoping for. Zebulon Ward never admitted fault, never was convicted of any crime, and so there were some, I think, limitations of the pursuit of justice through the courts in this way.
Yeah. Before I ask another question, does anybody want to ask a question now, or you guys still think I just want to make sure I give opportunities for others to jump in?
This is Alvin. I had a question.
Sure.
So after this suit, I guess, is fully litigated, did you do any research to see if there were other people that filed similar lawsuits after this one?
I've not come across, any that were exactly like this. Now, of course, there were efforts to pursue restitution and reparations for slavery. Callie House, another great book, is by Mary Frances Berry, My Face is Black as True, which is the biography of another formerly enslaved woman at the end of the 19th century who led a large grassroots movement to lobby Congress for what she called ex-slave pensions. And it tells the story of the harassment that she faced by federal officials. She was ultimately prosecuted for mail fraud, she and her fellow activists, because according to the government and the state, Congress would never give pensions to formerly enslaved people. And so by collecting dues from formerly enslaved people for this organization, they claimed she was making fraudulent, she was guilty of mail fraud. So that's a piece of the story. But the point is that there was clearly, reparations was clearly advocated by many, formerly enslaved people in a variety of spaces. There's also a very famous letter by a man named Jordan Anderson that was published in the Cincinnati Commercial, the same paper where Wood's interview with Lafcadio Hearn appeared. And in it, he writes to his former enslaver in Tennessee, basically explaining what he was due for the many years of labor that he had performed in Tennessee, and kind of totaling up the lost wages from his long enslavement. So the answer to your question is I did not find other cases exactly like this, but you do find lots of evidence of the argument for reparations being articulated in this period. Now, I will say that there are lots of examples of freedom suits, which you read in the book. Wood attempted to win a freedom suit in the 1850s in Kentucky. And there's a growing body of scholarship about these kinds of cases, which often did include claims for restitution. It became harder over the course of the antebellum period to win those. But there's a book called Before Dred Scott, for example, by Ann Twitty, that discusses similar cases in Missouri in the antebellum period. Trying to think of some other names off the litigating across, Black Litigants in the Antebellum South by Kimberly Welch, that shows even in Natchez, Mississippi, in the antebellum period, there were freedom suits being filed. So I think there is a lot of evidence of similar cases, never for the amount that Henrietta Wood received. And of course, each of those was litigated before slavery had been abolished. But I do think they form a context for this case. The other book, finally, that I'll mention is called Litigating Across the Color Line by Melissa Malusky. And she has gone through the state Supreme Court records, I think maybe not just the state Supreme Court records, but the highest court of appeals in southern states in the period from about 1865 to 1900, and found, if I'm remembering correctly, and I may be off, so you have to check me on this, about 6,000 lawsuits involving African-American litigants suing white defendants in the post-war South. And often, these were over small property claims, but often they involved issues that arose even before abolition. So they sort of litigated issues that had their roots in the slavery period. But they do show the kind of legal savvy and knowledge about the courts that I think you can see in the case of Henrietta Wood, that the courts were not sort of some distant place of recourse, but one that Black Southerners in the 19th century knew about and made use of when they could. So that, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but those are some of the things that came to mind.
It does, thank you.
So one of our members asked in the chat, Professor McDaniel, how soon did they start reforming the laws that were used as excuses to lock up former slaves in the workhouses?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, almost as soon as they could. It's a checkered history, because there was a moment immediately after the Civil War when, following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson became president. And Andrew Johnson was, as I talk a little bit about in the book, himself a white unionist, kind of in the Zeb Ward mold, who was elevated to the White House and advocated almost universal amnesty for a lot of former Confederates, and began giving out pardons right and left, and kind of signaling to state governments that he would pursue a lenient policy of Reconstruction. And so, right away in 1866, you start seeing Southern states passing penal codes that prosecute petty theft and crimes that had never been defined as felonies before were kind of being elevated to that status and punished with hard labor and worse. And then, of course, there's a period after that when Congress wrested back control of Reconstruction from Andrew Johnson, and a lot of those initial black codes were overturned for a time, in between around 1867 to 1876, 1877. But then there was, so right in the moment when Henrietta Wood's litigating her case, that's kind of the moment of opportunity where things had been fundamentally altered by the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. But following really the defeat of Reconstruction by determined counter-revolutionary forces in the South, new state governments came to power that were built on a premise of white supremacy at the end of the 19th century that reinstated a lot of those laws. And that's when you really see convict leasing as a system beginning to be taken up across the states of the former Confederacy.
Okay, another question through the chat. I was waiting to see if anyone wanted to ask one live, but I'll ask this one. So the question is, from a comparative perspective, were there any similar suits for reparations restitution in the British or French empires?
That's a good question. I don't know of any private lawsuits like this or civil lawsuits like this, but of course there were and are even ongoing movements for reparations in those other post-slavery societies. There's a book by Ana Lucia Araujo at Howard University that looks at reparations in comparative perspective, that details a lot of those examples. And there, in each case, because slavery ended in different ways in each of those settings, it kind of shaped the struggle for reparations. In the British context, emancipation came with compensation paid to former slave owners. 20 million, when Parliament passed an Emancipation Act in the early 1830s, it included 20 million pounds in restitution being paid to the slave owners in the British colonies. And so, as part of post-colonial movements for independence in the Caribbean, those have included movements for reparations. I'm not an expert on those. Professor Araujo would certainly be a better source there. But I don't know about individual lawsuits like this.
And we talked about reparations a good amount, both with our last book, Between the World and Me, and reading this book. The article you mentioned came up by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I'm curious about your process of tracing the impact that the award to Henrietta Wood had on her life and on her son's life. And I'm also curious if you did any research into Zebulon Ward's life and his ancestors and what happened there.
that's, when in the fall of 2015, I learned about Arthur Sims, that was a really clarifying moment, because it seemed, that here was a possibility of gauging not just the difference that the money made for Henrietta Wood, but also across generations. That's a key piece of what Coates argues in the case for reparations, is that reparations is not just about the historic wrongs of enslavement, but also the many legacies of that in American life. He focuses on redlining, for example, in Chicago, and that was a powerful article, I think, precisely because it did bring things up into the very recent past and into the 20th century, and focused on a particular family. Focused on Clyde Ross and his struggle to fight these exploitative contract lending and home buying practices in Chicago, and redlining. And so learning that, Sims had lived in Chicago, had lived in houses right in those same neighborhoods on the South Side that Coates was talking about, made it possible to think about those legacies in Henrietta Wood's case. And I was fortunate in the course of writing the book to meet some of the descendants of Henrietta Wood, who were able to talk a little bit about their family and what their family had achieved. And there was not actually a lot of knowledge about Henrietta Wood and her victory in the suit, which is kind of interesting. There was an article, by the way, in the Washington Post a few weeks ago that I could certainly provide you with later, speaking with some of those descendants and talking about their learning about the story. With Zebulon Ward, I had less luck talking with descendants. I did identify some. They were a little warier about talking with me. So I don't have as much to report there. When I reached out, and initially I kind of said, I'm working on a book about one of your ancestors, Zebulon Ward. Didn't really go into all the details about why or I was interested in him or what the story was, but I wasn't really. And at first, I heard back, oh, and it was actually it was a lawyer, I should say. And so I thought, well, it's a lawyer and might be interested in the case, and might want to help. And at first, he wrote back and said it was his wife who was a descendant. Oh yeah, I think we just got a trunk full of papers, like old family papers from a cousin, and we could go through them and see if any date from that period. Of course, as a historian, my eyes are lighting up.
Yeah, you're jumping up and down. Yeah.
But then crickets, for many months, and then when I was kind of finishing the book, it was kind of getting time to go to press. I gave it kind of one last try and emailed and said, I just laid it all out. I said, this is why I'm interested. Here's what I'm doing. And I kind of tried to say, right now I'm only able to understand Zebulon Ward through the public record, which, and he doesn't come off looking so good. Maybe there's some private correspondence or something that could give a full picture, but still no response. So never really was able there. It seems unlikely to me, just from what they said about the trunk, that there was anything in it that does date to that period. But it is a gap in what we know is there's not a lot of private material about Ward. Now the Brandon clan, I should say, was much more helpful and forthcoming, and shared documents about Brandon Hall and about Gerard Brandon's family. So some of the sources in the book that were very helpful, like the journal that Brandon kept of his time in Texas, and this, the long trek, and mentioning Henrietta by name in that journal, and giving an insight into what the experience of people who went on that forced march was like, was possible partly because there were people in the Brandon family who wanted to preserve these materials, make them available to researchers, put them in the Historic Natchez Foundation, and there were some letters that Brandon wrote from Texas that had also been found in like a cedar trunk, kind of like I was describing earlier, that had never been unfolded, never really been read. And so I do have to give credit to them for making those available.
Well, we're so glad.
I have a question, Krisina.
Yes, please.
Professor McDaniel, did you face any opposition while conducting research or even after the book was published?
I'm fortunate to say I haven't encountered much opposition. I think it's kind of hard to argue with a story in a way. The story is powerful, and I think it's my hope is that even people, I have heard from people who read the book telling me that they were kind of resistant to the idea of reparations, and found their thinking about it change a little bit upon reading it. I don't know if that's common. I wouldn't hazard a guess about that, but I do think that's kind of what I hoped focusing on an individual story might do. Now there's some costs there that are similar to the limitations that we were talking about with one suit, because when you start moving from, everyone can kind of agree Henrietta Wood should have gotten her day in court and she should have gotten her just due, but when you start talking more broadly about HR 40 in Congress, or creating a larger commission to study the effects of slavery and make recommendations about reparations, then I think you enter more contentious waters, as we can see from a lot of my fellow historians who have engaged with the 1619 Project, for example, in the New York Times, have encountered some of that in our very polarized political moment. So I have to say, I encountered a lot of interest in the story and support for the research in the story. But I do think that's both a virtue and maybe a disadvantage of focusing on one story, one person's experience.
As a follow-up question to your conversations with Henrietta Wood's descendants, you learned a lot, and through you, we learned a lot about Henrietta Wood. Mm-hmm. Were there times where you were sharing things with her descendants that they were hearing for the first time, or they were super excited about or not too happy about? Can you tell us a little bit about any of those outliers?
Absolutely. So, the first person in the family that I met was a woman named Winona Adkins, who is the great granddaughter, was the great. She unfortunately passed away from cancer at the beginning of 2018. But I was able to meet with her in her home in Oakland and speak with her and look through photos, some of the photos that are reproduced in the book. And she was aware of the Lafcadio Hearn interview with Henrietta Wood. But if you remember, in 1876, that interview doesn't give the outcome of the case because it hadn't concluded yet. So she wasn't aware of the outcome of the case. And she also did not know that Arthur Sims had been born in slavery. This was a man that she remembered as her great grandfather. And when he died, she was 7 or 8 years old. So she had memories of living in the same house with him on the south side of Chicago. But did not know that he had been born in Mississippi before the Civil War. And so that I think that opens a window onto what's difficult about these histories, and different families, I think, handle those pasts in different ways. And in some cases, maybe the stories are very well known and passed down over generations, and in other cases, families deal with these difficult pasts partly by not talking about them openly, or not passing on those stories. So in the Washington Post article that I was mentioning earlier, there's some conversation with David Blackman, who was Winona Adkins's cousin, who also provided some key documents in the book. For example, the contract that Henrietta Wood entered into with Gerard Brandon after the Civil War. That was the earliest document that mentioned Arthur by name. And in this, oh, thank you, Krisina found it. But he talked about finding that contract, or copy of that contract, in his mother's house, kind of going through her papers and her things after she had died, but not knowing what it meant, and never having really heard stories from his mother about Henrietta Wood. Didn't know who that was, or why this was there. And so there were kind of pieces that fell into place, things that I was able to share with them, but then also definitely things that they were able to share with me that made some connections clearer.
So I've received another question, and I think it is a good segue based on Megan's question. She was asking about the opposition you received, and you said, well, it's kind of hard to argue with the story. And I think it's really hard to argue with the story you wrote because of how thoroughly you researched the story, your very thorough list of sources. And then I also noticed your appendix that you have on sources. And so this question that I received relates to that. And the question is, how should we evaluate the reliability of sources today? Does an author's rigorous analysis of the sources for his work apply to our evaluation of sources for any period of history? How do we deal with the explosion of data?
Yeah, I mean, those are very good questions. I think, for historians, I do think that there's certain methods or principles that we use that I'm sure are very familiar to you as lawyers as well, of always trying to put sources in their context, think about the perspective of the person producing the source. That's one thing certainly any historian of this period wrestles with, the fact that even these interviews with Henrietta Wood are filtered through the white men who interviewed her and recorded the story and left some things out, and chose what to include and what not to include. So there's always those kind of silences in the archive that we're working against as historians. And I think to some extent, the even with the explosion of data in the present, that doesn't necessarily mean that that all experiences are captured, even in the data that we have. So it's not just a quantity problem, it's also the character of the sources themselves and what's important to the people keeping the archives to preserve and write down. So I think, even with a future historian going through trying to understand the present moment, for example, using social media or something like that, I think they would still have to ask a lot of the same questions that somebody looking at the 19th century has to ask about the moment in which those sources appeared, what the audience for them was, what the perspective was, what's included and what's not included, what's encoded kind of in the sources themselves that might reflect the structures of power that are present at that moment in time. So I do think there's methods that apply across the board. I think I've probably wandered away from the original question now. It was about.
No, I think that was very helpful. There were multiple questions, so I think you touched on some of the main points. So thank you. It was asking about reliability of sources and how you evaluate that, and especially now when there's so much information.
Yeah, I think it's, I think as a historian, I would say, and probably lawyers too, I try to get my students to kind of think about sources as a prosecuting attorney. You're constantly probing it, you're constantly questioning the evidence, rather than just taking it for granted that it happened exactly as it said. I mean, think about the story that Zebulon Ward spun about the case and all of the distortions in his telling of the story, that only further research could show. Think about, I was noticing today, people referring back to, the very first reports of George Floyd's death by the police department and by the press. How was it described at that moment in time versus what we know about it, now, and what was made clear because of different kinds of sources like the video recording of it. So you kind of always have to think about sources in that prosecutorial light, because every source has biases of a kind, and rather than that making some sources reliable and some sources unreliable, it just means that different sources can tell us different things. I mean, even the unreliable source of Zebulon Ward's distorted telling of the story, in its very unreliability, it tells us something, doesn't it? I mean, it still tells us something about that moment in time and what he's able to get away with saying and what he chooses to emphasize and what he doesn't emphasize. So yes, it's an unreliable source for figuring out what actually happened, but it's a very reliable source for answering the question of how did, white Americans like him after abolition think about a case like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting. Does anyone else have a question for Professor McDaniel?
Krisina, can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
Thanks. Professor, I wanted to say that I'm very appreciative of you intentionally using former enslaved persons as opposed to slaves. And I was just wondering what your approach was to word choice and language when you conduct a writing project that encapsulates or captures what happened historically, but also honors the humanity of the people you're writing about, like how you approach that balance.
It's a great question, and I'm not sure that that I have the best answer or the most satisfactory response. I think historians have been in the last 5 to 10 years really thinking a lot about these questions, and I think there's been a huge change even between the time that I started researching the book and today, and you can see that reflected in the book itself. I think the argument that is made for talking about enslaved people as opposed to slaves, and the really compelling reason for that is, as you say, to focus on the agency of enslaved people, the lived experience of enslaved people, their lives, and centering that in these narratives. And I hope that comes through in the narrative as well, in the book, that's what we want to see from Henrietta Wood's history. I think in my own mind, there are times in the narrative where, nonetheless, despite that reality, the fact that the laws recognized slavery and that people could be sold and bequeathed and collateralized and leveraged for debt, that can't be avoided either, because we won't understand the lived experience of Henrietta Wood as a person without understanding the legal structures that treated her as property at certain moments in time. And so, I think in writing the book, I tried, although I don't think I was always successful, to, in those places where I was focusing on that property aspect, the structure aspect of the story, there might be a place to talk about slavery or slaves. but then when talking about the experiences of Henrietta Wood in that system, to use a different set of words that would highlight that. I'm not sure that if I were starting the book today, I would make those same choices, because I think there are strong arguments to focus on the personhood in every context of the people that are at the center of these narratives. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that's the way I was thinking about it then, and the way I'm thinking about it now.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you, sir.
In the few minutes we have left, I received a question that I was planning on asking you myself, and that's, what's your next project, Professor McDaniel? What are you focusing on, working on now?
Well, you mentioned at the outset that I'm co-chairing a task force here at Rice on the history of slavery, segregation, and racial injustice, and its connection to the history of Rice University. So a lot of my time right now is being spent on the research around that. A lot of it involves the same kind of archival work that you see in the book, but with relation to the deep history of the Rice Institute and its founders. And so that's what's taking up most of my time right now. I also chairing the history department, which is a whole nother set of things that take up my time. So I haven't yet, decided on a next book project, but I would invite anyone interested in the work of the task force to check out our website, taskforce.rice.edu. There's some great webinars there, including not just about Rice history, but one we just had last week on segregated Houston that has some wonderful lectures by Tawana Steptoe at University of Arizona and Frank Garidi at Columbia University that provide a history of Black Houston in the 1960s. And so there's a lot of great material there, and I'm looking forward to more such programming in the months to come.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent recommendation. We'll be sure to check it out, and I'll share it with the people who attended.
One too on the trial, the lawyers. There's one about the charter trial in the 1960s, where the trustees of Rice went to court to change the original charter that had limited the institute to the white inhabitants of Houston and Texas. And there's a fascinating legal history around that case, and there's a webinar there on our past events too.
Excellent. Well, I see that it's now 7 o'clock, and as you just mentioned, we know you're very busy, so we want to be mindful of your time. Thank you for sharing this hour with us. It's
been a pleasure, and thanks for the great questions, and most of all for taking the time to read the book and discuss it. And I'm just really honored that you'd spend your time on it, and wish you all the best in all of your work. Thanks for all the work that you do.
Thank you. And if you don't mind, we're going to take a quick photo, if that's okay. So anyone who's comfortable being in the photo, turn on their cameras. If not, turn them off, and I'll give you a countdown. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. And one more, because always there's a eye closed.
I probably blinked.
Yes, I've done this enough to know to take a second photo. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Got it. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you,
Professor.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you.